Hello, everyone. I know a lot of you are just tuning in right now, but I'm Gina Chavez. I'm here with the Center for Public Policy Priorities. And I am live at the Texas Capitol today, and it's very quiet. The halls are empty and doors are closed, but in a few months, all that's going to change. And one of the things that's going to generate the most activity, but the least buzz outside of these walls is the Texas budget and the Texas budget process. And so we're here today to shine a light on the Texas budget. What's in the Texas budget? Why should we care as everyday Texans? And so we're going to be joined by a few special guests, and one of them we'll start with our CEO, Ann Beeson, and she'll kind of talk about how long, why the center, why we work on the Texas budget. She'll shine a light on, kind of why we should care as everyday Texans. How does it affect our lives? How we can get involved and learn more. Eva DeLuna Castro is one of the leading experts on the Texas budget and the process, which can be very complicated. And so she's gonna talk to us and dive into the nuts and bolts of what actually happens here at the Capitol. How does a budget get passed? What things get cut, and how do those decisions get made? And then later we'll be joined by Stacy Wilson, who's the president of the Children's Hospital Association of Texas. And she'll kind of help us understand how does the budget affect not only organizations, but the organizations that help our families and help our kids. And how, again, do those cuts make a difference in the lives of everyday Texans? So I know that people are still joining, so I'm going to hang out with y'all while we wait for some more people to come on. I do want to let you know that you can ask questions. You can type questions into the comment box on Facebook. We will be able to get to those later in the live session here. If you're just joining, my name is Gina Chavez, and I'm here with the Center for Public Policy Priorities. I've been with the center for about 7 years. I'm a communications associate, and we're going to be joined by a few experts, not only from the center, but also from outside of the center. And we're talking about the Texas budget today. We're talking about why it matters to Texans. We're talking about how you can get involved, or why you should get involved, and how each of the steps in the process, how they affect Texans, even though honestly, most of us don't even know that it's going on. We don't know that the budget process is happening. We don't know that we can have a voice in that process. And then we just get affected by the cuts or the things that get funded here in our state. And so we think this is a really important thing here at the center, and so that's why we're here live at the Texas Capitol today. And so I think we're going to go ahead and start. I'd like to invite our CEO, Ann Beeson, to come join me, and we're going to dive into this here. So
good morning, Gina.
Welcome, Ann. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I know it's so quiet here.
It is.
It's wild to come to the Capitol. The center works on a lot of issues, and we're here at the Capitol during legislative session, and so it's very weird to be here at a time when the halls are so empty. So, but I think today we're here to shine a light on the Texas budget process, which is one of the most important things that happens during a legislative session, but one of the things that I think most Texans know the least about. And so, Ann, why don't you help us understand, why does the center work on the budget? And why does it matter for everyday Texans?
Sure. Well, we work on the budget because we care about Texas and the prosperity of Texans. We believe in a Texas that enables everyone to compete and succeed in life, and we think that means they should be able to be healthy, well-educated, and financially secure. And whether or not we have that ability and chance for Texans depends very much, believe it or not, on the Texas budget. We think about the Texas budget, when we think budget, we think numbers. Mm-hmm. You probably have this image, and that would be the right image of like a big giant book with a whole bunch of numbers in it. Mm-hmm. It's much more than numbers. It's actually a document that tells us about our priorities and values as a state and as a set of communities. We all use highways. We all use state parks. We care about our public schools. If you care about any of those issues, any of the infrastructure that we have as a state that affects whether or not Texans can succeed, you got to care about the state budget.
Well, and I like that you mentioned priorities, and I think if we think about as a family, right, when we're making a budget, it's like we have to make priorities, right? Mm-hmm. We have to say, okay, well, we're budgeting for a big trip, so we're not going to, buy certain, things we might want at the grocery store. We're just going to get the basics or whatever. Is that kind of how it works with the Texas budget?
Absolutely. I mean, basically what our elected leaders are deciding when they decide how much of our state money goes to certain parts of the budget is what our priorities are, what our values are. And we need to make it clear as constituents and as Texans, what do we want those priorities to be? And that's why, in fact, it's so important for Texans to be involved in the budget process. If you care about health care, you should be paying attention not just to all the opportunities to engage directly on specific healthcare policy debates, but also about the amount of money that we as a state and a community are investing in healthcare. Mm-hmm. These decisions are going to affect everything from like how good the public school is that your child is able to go to, how close is the nearest hospital, if one of your loved ones has an emergency. Is your car going to fall into one of those giant potholes that we just seem to have an increasing number of all over the state? All of those things are going to be affected by the Texas budget.
So how do we get involved?
That's a great question.
What should we care about?
Well, and I'll just say that I realize I didn't really answer your question more specifically about why it is that the center works on these issues. And just to say, we have been experts in fiscal policy for nearly 30 years. And we got into it specifically because, as I said, we care about healthcare policy. We care about education policy. We care about workforce policy. And we saw that if we're going to try to influence policies to ensure good outcomes for Texans, we have to also understand the state budget. And so for many decades now, we have been one of the only groups that has a dedicated expertise on the Texas budget and fiscal policy. One of our jobs is absolutely to help provide support and information to all of the stakeholders all over Texas that want to understand and get engaged. And we very much hope that you all will use the information we provide, will rely on us as a resource for information about the budget, and that'll make it easier for you when the key times come, and our amazing budget guru, Eva, is going to come up in a minute and explain this in much more detail. It'll give you the information you need to be engaged in the budget process, to share with your elected officials and other influential people in your community what are the impacts of the decision your elected leaders about to make about the budget.
Well, and you talk about stakeholders. So, does that just mean our elected officials, or?
It means elected officials not just at the state level, but at the local level, right? Because dollars often flow down. I mean, they flow down, first of all, from the federal government to the state, and then the state often has lots of decisions to make about how those resources are redirected to communities. Okay. And similarly, obviously, our revenue that comes obviously through various forms of taxes. The state is making decisions about how to deploy that revenue, and that's where we need to get involved. And it's very important to be communicating not just with your state legislators about your priorities and values and what you think is best for us as a community, but also your local leaders to kind of help get them engaged, because we need mayors and city councils and county judges and commissioners to also make a case for what we need in our own backyard, and that is very much affected by the Texas budget.
Right. Well, and I think the other piece is understanding how past budgets can affect the current status and even, our future prosperity or lack thereof. So, and maybe we can dive into that a little bit with Eva, but I don't know if you have anything to say about, are there certain cuts that are maybe past cuts that we're still dealing with? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, obviously everything is cumulative, just like family wealth, to go back to your example. You know what I mean? How much money is in your family budget this month is affected by how much you spent last month.
Right.
And the same thing is true of the state budget. And unfortunately, even though we are very much a growing state, we are a growing and changing state, our population has exploded, state investments overall have declined. And that is a real concern. And just to focus in specifically on public education for a minute, which we believe obviously is the key to stability, financial stability and prosperity for most people. We have had a state that has paid less and less money to support public education, even though the vast majority of Texans really believe very strongly in a strong public school system.
Right. Well, and I think that's a good segue to, we're going to talk to Eva, our kind of budget guru at the center, but I do want to just kind of re-welcome people who might be just joining. Once again, my name is Gina Chavez, and this is Ann Beeson. She's the CEO of the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and today we are here live at the Texas Capitol to talk about the Texas budget and the Texas budget process. I do want to remind you, if you're joining us, you can, by all means, please ask questions. You can just type them in, and we'll get to those a little later in the segment. We're talking about the Texas budget because it informs so much of what actually happens during session and what happens for us as everyday Texans. It informs a lot of things that affect our daily lives, but I think it generates so little buzz outside of these walls that we're here today to shine a light on that. So, Ann, thank you so much. We're going to have you back in a little bit. And we're going to welcome Eva De Luna Castro, who is our budget guru at the center, and she's one of the state's leading experts on the Texas budget. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you for having me, Gina.
So I guess let's start. We're going to dive a little bit further into the Texas budget process, and again, kind of the nuts and bolts of the Texas budget. So maybe we can start at where are we in the process right now?
As you mentioned earlier, it's kind of quiet here at the Capitol. But we are about, I guess there's, in any given point, we're at two different budget cycles. Right now, we're almost halfway through the 2018-2019 budget. The legislature comes to Austin and writes a budget that lasts for 2 years. And then we're about to start the process of planning and developing the 2020 and 21 budget. So at any point, we're in two different cycles. And we have a fabulous communications staff that helps people understand where we are. We'll show this in a better version on our website. You can get a lot of these materials, but we're basically at a stage where agencies are about to be told how much money they can ask for 2020 and 21, the budget that the legislature will write when they come to Austin next January.
So essentially, we're kind of always in the Texas budget process. Is that what I'm hearing? It's this cyclical.
Right.
It's never ending.
We call it the wheel of fun.
Yes. Oh my gosh! And how fun is it, Eva?
Sometimes not quite as entertaining. If you're a budget analyst, there's lots of numbers involved. I think a big challenge for us at the center is how to make this real to people. You talked with Ann about the fact that it actually does touch a lot of people in ways that we may all be aware of, parks, schools, everything. But then there's some things that you have to think, what could we do? What could we do more of? Where could we invest more for there to be a better payoff for our economy, for our future generations? And the budget process, unfortunately, kind of starts with where we are. There's not a lot of room for the ideal, like how should we be doing this? But at least it is something that reaches public education, and higher education is a huge part of the budget. If you think about the fact that 1 out of 4 Texans is enrolled in a public school, bringing higher education, and that's 1 out of 5 Texans. I'm sorry, I'm doing that the other way around. 1 out of 4 Texans is involved in either public or higher education. And healthcare programs, those two things that we work on the most, education, health. Healthcare programs reach about also similar amount of 1 out of 5 Texans. So the impact that has on our economy, the jobs created in public schools, what we can do to help students just be part of society basically and contribute, all of that is a result of the Texas budget.
Yeah. Well, and I even want to point out that isn't it, it's about 1 in every 10 children born in the United States is born in Texas. So, what happens in Texas has a huge effect, not only here just in the state and in our local communities, but also for the future of our country. Mm-hmm. And so, we do like to pride ourselves on being Texans, and I think that's one of the reasons, because we do have a big impact here. Can you talk to me a little bit, I know I talked a little bit with Ann about how maybe, the things that get passed or get cut how they affect us, in this process. And so what are some of the nuts and bolts things? Are there cuts that we're still dealing with? Are there things that we're expecting to kind of be the bigger players this year in the Texas budget process? Let's dive into that.
We will definitely, I think, be hearing more about what cuts mean in healthcare, especially children's access to healthcare. So I'll focus on the issue of what cuts mean to public education. And again, a lot of information is on our website. The one thing that jumps to mind is how overcrowded our classrooms became after the cuts in 2011. There were pretty big cuts in the budget. The budget has to balance. That's the main challenge for the legislature. But in 2011, billions of dollars in state aid were taken out of formulas and grants. And since at least 2/3 of what schools are spending is on payroll, what you saw showing up is fewer teachers. At least 40,000 teachers should have been in the classroom teaching, and they weren't because of those budget cuts. And it's taken a long time to recover from that. Some school districts still aren't back to where they used to be. So what we're talking about basically is more students per teacher, and it makes it more challenging for that teacher to spend time with each student and to make sure that not just that they're doing well on all these standardized tests, but that they're learning everything else they need to learn to advance and to succeed. So I think that's the single biggest piece of the Texas budget. So that's also where you see the most cuts. You also see what Ann Beeson referred to earlier, more pressure on local property taxes. A lot of the growth in Texas is people moving here from other states. So the new Texans out there, you might notice more challenges on the roads, more overcrowded classrooms. You might see a bigger property tax bill than you used to. Again, those are all outcomes of how the state budgets and how it's been investing less and less over time, certainly in public education. In higher education, you see rising tuition. You might see students that don't get to take the classes that they needed to, and they have to wait another semester or two. So it affects, again, 5 million public students that are maybe not as able to learn as well as they used to, another 1.5 million college students, and then we'll hear more about what cuts mean in healthcare.
Yeah. Well, and from Facebook, we have a couple comments and questions. Somebody said this is a growing state, but state budget investments have declined. Can we talk a little bit more about this?
I think what again the main challenges in Texas is that even 25 years ago, when I first started looking at a lot of these budget choices, we had already a budget that was one of the smallest relative to the number of Texans. There's 28 million people living in Texas now, but we've always been a big state geographically, population-wise, but low spending. If we've always been kind of very frugal, in the bottom 5 per capita, we aren't starting with a lot of things that we can cut. And then when bad times come along, a recession, for example, the one that led to the 2011 cuts, our budget depends a lot, extremely dependent on sales taxes. So when the economy doesn't do well, our tax system doesn't do well. And unfortunately, legislators, once the economy recovers, have chosen, in some cases, to make tax cuts a priority. Instead of putting the money back, state aid for schools and all that, they've chosen to just kind of say, well, we've reduced state aid, we'll just kind of let local property taxes take on more and more of the responsibility there, and we'll have tax cuts at the state level. So I would point to that as one of the main reasons why we are seeing a budget that every 2 years gets more and more stretched. We're also adding things to the budget that didn't used to be there. You came in this morning and went through security, and the Department of Public Safety officer screened everything. That is now part of the general revenue budget, and it didn't used to be there. So when we make choices about trying to take on more responsibilities, but also choices to reduce the amount of revenue available to pay for it, that is going to create problems and challenges for legislators.
Okay. I do want to just welcome people who might be joining. My name is Gina Chavez, and I'm here with Eva DeLuna Castro. We're here from the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and today we are shining a light on the Texas budget, on what's in the Texas budget, where we are in the process, and how you can get involved. Please ask questions in the comments below, and they will get to us. Speaking of which, we had another one. Somebody requested a car analogy for the budget.
A car analogy.
This is your tough question for the day.
Let's see. I remember, actually, one of my favorite car analogies has to do with healthcare. It's actually stolen from our coworker, Ann Dunkelberg. She talks about...
She'll never know.
She's not watching this. She's too busy. She works on Medicaid and CHIP, Children's Health Insurance. And what's happened in healthcare, we'll hear more about this in a moment, is we don't always put enough funding into it to cover caseload growth and medical costs. If you're going to provide medical services to anybody, you know, every year maybe the cost of prescription drugs goes up, or the cost of x-rays or whatever labs. Anyways, more costs, more people. But when legislators choose to put the same amount of funding into Medicaid and CHIP, or sometimes even less, you're going to see problems. You're going to have access problems. You're going to have shortages of providers. And so what she talks about is, if your car runs out of gasoline, you don't just leave it by the side of the road. You put more gasoline in it. I think that is, to me, is a really good way to explain a lot of the challenges with our healthcare systems. When they're underfunded, they're not going to work as well. The same as if a car isn't properly maintained and doesn't have enough fuel, it's just not going to get you as far as it needs to go. So there's a lot of other analogies I've used over the years involving crashes and collisions and emergency care, but those are a little grim for this time of the morning. Maybe another one to think about, and let me know if I'm going on too long, but the way that a car works, where it needs different components functioning at the same time. And this was referred to earlier by Ann Beeson when she mentioned that the budget is something that affects local property taxes, so there's a state-local kind of partnership. There's also the fact that the state budget brings in federal money, and so when you look at how all those things fit together, if the state piece of it is a little out of whack, then the other two won't function properly. So we'll hear from local officials on a regular basis. If you read your newspaper, city and county officials are affected by what's in the budget because they're part of this services that we're all trying to keep going for a growing Texan. When the state piece of that isn't big enough, it puts more burden on what cities and counties have to do. So in order for the whole thing to function the way a car functions, if one thing isn't there that needs to be there, then you're going to have problems. So.
Okay. Well, again, for those just joining us, we're talking about the Texas budget process. We do encourage you to write comments and questions below. And before you leave, Eva, we actually, in a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Stacy Wilson, who's the president of the Children's Hospital Association of Texas, and she'll kind of give us a more real idea of how the budget, can affect Texans and families and our children. And so, anyway, but before you go, we have a question. Is there a projection as to how much federal funding will come to Texas in the next couple of years? Is it more or less?
That's actually a great question because that's something that all Texans could do something about. We work, obviously, on policy and budget issues. This year, we're also starting to be more involved in what the census means for Texas. And there's a piece of that not everybody is well aware of, where billions of dollars in federal aid are affected by the census. So we know people, they might think this is intrusive and I don't want to fill out all these questions, but formulas for foster care and for health care, for hospital funding, for roads, for education, a lot of that depends on how, and we're talking 2020, a few years out, but right now the expectation is that some of the programs that bring a lot of money to Texas, like military spending and Medicare and Social Security, will at least keep up with inflation. It's those other programs that we work on, Medicaid and CHIP, child care. Child care is actually getting a little more money these days, but that's something we can help you with, depending on what exactly you're interested in. But that the census is turning out to be a pretty big factor in how much future federal funds will come back to Texas to help us pay for roads and education and health care. So that's actually a pretty good question and something we can do something about.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eva. Right now we are going to have Stacy Wilson, who is the president of the Children's Hospital Association of Texas, and she's going to join us, and we're going to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Gina. We actually haven't met.
Hi, Gina. Stacy Wilson. So nice to see you.
All right, well, welcome. So,
Thanks.
again, for people just joining us, we're talking about the Texas budget. We're here live at the Capitol. It's so quiet right now, but in a few months, it's going to be a buzz with activity. And one of the things that's the most important that really informs what happens during the legislative session is the Texas budget and the budget process. And so, we're here shining a light on that because there are ways that you can get involved, and this does matter for everyday Texans. And so Stacy's going to help us understand a little bit more how this abstract thing really can affect the lives of our Texas families. Well, Stacy, like I said, the process can seem really abstract. And so, I'm wondering, we all know what a children's hospital is, and we know why that's important. So how does the budget affect children's hospitals here?
The most important thing that the Texas budget does is it funds Medicaid and CHIP. CHIP is the Children's Health Insurance Program, and as Eva mentioned, we get a lot of federal funds for Medicaid and CHIP. So in Medicaid, for every dollar that's paid out to a healthcare provider like a children's hospital, 40 cents of that comes from the state budget, 60 cents of that comes from the federal budget. So if you think about it, it's a partnership between our federal and state governments, but that 40 cents on the dollar that we pay out is so important. And as Eva again mentioned, if we're not keeping up with the number of children in Texas that are growing and growing and growing, then you've got a car that's going to run out of gas because we're just not keeping up with cost growth. We're not keeping up with the number of children who are moving to the state. There's a new drug that comes out that's curative. And of course, if you're a mom or a dad, you want to make sure your child has access to that drug. But of course, the drugs are expensive. So how do we keep up with the advancements in technology, new machinery that's out there, new equipment, while kind of keeping the same amount of money we've always paid for Medicaid and CHIP?
Right. And like you said, it's not necessarily even just about maintaining because there's growth happening, and
Correct.
so that maintenance might need to step up, but it doesn't always do that, I'm sure.
No, it does not.
Is there anything that we're kind of expecting in healthcare this session? Eva mentioned that kind of education and healthcare are two of the biggest pieces of the Texas budget. What are our expectations for what's coming?
That's a really great question. We know there's been a lot of discussion both at the federal and state level on opioids. Neonatal abstinence syndrome is a big issue for the state. We have a lot of babies who are unfortunately born addicted to drugs, and that's been a big thing. We also are looking at immunizations. There are a lot of kids that are not becoming immunized for various reasons, and the question becomes, at what point is that a tipping point? So you're concerned about kids who are otherwise healthy who are being exposed to people who have not been inoculated.
Right.
We also know there's been a lot of discussion about Hurricane Harvey and what's going to be happening with it. A lot of mental health conditions for kids who are displaced. They've lost their schools, they've lost their homes. They're not coping well with that, as well as a lot of asthma conditions and bronchiolitis, as you can imagine from that area, and mold and whatnot happening. So we're expecting kind of those three issues to kind of rise to the top.
Okay. Well, and maybe, we also talked about how past budgets and cuts can also affect where we are right now and the future. And so are there certain, effects that children's hospitals and, subsequently families have seen in recent years due to budget cuts or budgets that don't keep up with population growth or inflation?
Yes. So what's happening is that the way children's hospitals get paid actually hasn't been increased. We're based on numbers, the costs we incurred back in 2011. So as you can imagine, costs have increased since 2011. If you're paying budget, you're paying your budget for your house, you know that it costs more for electricity today than it did in 2011.
Right.
Well, the same's true with the hospital, right? It's got overhead, it's got employees, it's got, costs have risen, but the price that the money that we're getting paid for delivering services has not increased over time.
Okay.
And so, because it's based on those antiquated costs.
And so what happens, how do people make do? Do hospitals close, or is it like teachers where you're losing employees, or?
That's a really great question. Each hospital deals with it differently. We've had a lot of rural hospitals close. I think 13 or 14 rural hospitals have closed over the last few years. Children's hospitals basically do a lot of cost shifting because those bills are going to come in and you're going to have to pay them. So the question is, how do you get a right number of dollars coming in to meet your obligations?
Right.
So a lot of times what happens is those costs get passed to a commercial payer. because we've got to have those monies coming in.
Right.
We also have become very reliant on some supplemental Medicaid programs that supplement what Medicaid doesn't pay on the front end.
And so for Texas families, what does that mean? If you have a hospital that's closed and you're in a rural community and you have an emergency, what happens?
Well, you end up either with Life Flight taking you somewhere, and many air ambulances don't,
Which is very expensive.
and they don't accept insurance. So that's an out-of-pocket cost that you would have, or you end up driving a long, long way to try to access, for example, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, because there aren't a lot of specialists in
Right.
our rural communities. We're doing a lot at children's hospitals with telemedicine. So one of the great things that children's hospitals have been doing is realizing we have so many of the specialties in-house. How do we then broadcast that out so that
Right.
a primary care provider in a rural part of the state can talk to a specialist
Right.
with the child and the child's parent to get the kind of treatment and consultation that they need. So we're seeing a rapid expansion of telemedicine, especially for telepsychiatry services, tele-NICU services for your neonatal intensive care units, as well as some of the tele-ER even. So,
All right. Wow, that's cool. I
Yeah.
heard a lot about that during Hurricane Harvey.
yes,
Because obviously it's harder to get people to the situation. so
absolutely.
that's really cool.
Absolutely.
Can you help describe what lawmakers can do to help ensure that Texas children do have access to the health services that they need?
The big thing is, there are 3.5 about million children covered by Medicaid or CHIP. So that's about half the kids in the state have some kind of government health care program.
Wow.
So if you'll think about it, Medicaid, in a lot of states, they expanded Medicaid to cover adults. We don't do that in Texas. In Texas, it's children, it's pregnant women, the age, blind, and disabled. I mean, it is the most vulnerable part of our population that is covered by Medicaid. And CHIP, of course, is just children. So a lot of the funding decisions that these lawmakers sitting in these rooms are going to make are going to impact children, because we make up about 70% of the Medicaid population and all of the children's population, the CHIP
Wow.
population. So it's so heavily intensive on children that those Medicaid and CHIP funding decisions that they make impact what children can get, especially around physician care, specialty care, therapy care. All of that is funded through the state budget.
Wow. Some of you may just be joining us, or you might just need a friendly reminder that we do have some experts here today. We're talking about the Texas budget, and we want to hear your questions. We know that it can be kind of a nebulous, abstract thing, but if you drive on Texas roads, if you go to Texas parks, if you go to the library, all of these things are funded by the Texas budget. We're here talking with Stacy Wilson, the president of the Children's Hospital Association of Texas, because the budget affects hospitals. The budget affects education, and so these are things that affect all of us, and we want to know your questions. We also want to know how we can get involved. I just kind of asked how lawmakers can affect things, but I guess lawmakers need to hear from us. And so, what are some of the things that we can do in order to help our lawmakers understand what's a priority for us?
Sure. There are a couple things. Number one, you can get on the chat website at chatexas.com and sign up to become a children's advocate. We send out information about how you can get involved to help support children's health care. You can also Google who represents me and put in your address. It'll tell you who your elected officials are. And so you can communicate with them directly. They love to hear from their constituents. If there is something that really impacts you and you're very concerned about, pick up the phone and call them. You can email them. It's very important for them to hear what's important to you because they represent you. So you don't have to drive down to Austin and sit in a hearing room for 25 hours to get testimony. It's simple to pick up the phone and call. It's simple to send an email. And again, if it's something that is meaningful to you and something that's important to you, I would encourage you to find out who your elected officials are and make your views known to them.
Well, I think that's a great segue. We're gonna kind of wrap it up. But Stacy, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to meet you.
Having
Absolutely.
We're gonna close out with Ann Beeson. So she's our CEO at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and she was with us earlier. But if you're just tuning in, Anne, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me back. It's been a great conversation.
I keep saying that, it's like, it feels so lonely over here at the Capitol because it's so empty. So I'm glad that we're here and, kind of shining a light on this process, on the Texas budget process. There is still time for questions. If you have any, please type them, and we'll get them answered before we sign off here. But Anne, let's continue what Stacy had just said, and let's talk a little bit more about how Texans can get involved. What can we do?
Absolutely. Well, we are here to help you understand the budget. So one thing is I would strongly encourage everyone, if you aren't doing it already, to sign up for our e-newsletter and follow us on social media. There are many resources that we'll have, and we are always, ambassadors for our fabulous partners like the Children's Health Association that you heard from. So many great groups put out really good information on the Texas budget that can help you as a citizen become involved and active on the issues that you care about. So, sign up for our stuff, look for other organizations that provide great information about the budget, and talk to your lawmakers, whatever way is easiest for you. By email, picking up the phone, going to town hall meetings for your candidates. I mean, it's really just very important, just as it is on every other issue that you care about, to get involved in the Texas budget.
Right. Well, and I think what's been so important today is understanding that, there's so many nuts and bolts to what actually happens during a legislative session. And a lot of time, I don't think people understand that the Texas budget informs those things. And so you may not be a budget analyst or care about the actual numbers themselves, but if you care about education, if you care about hospitals, if you care about Medicaid and CHIP, then we need to be involved in the budget process. That's kind of what I'm understanding, is that
absolutely,
whatever issue you care about in Texas, the budget is going to have an effect on it, and so it's time to kind of find out how we can insert ourselves in the process.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I'm sure that many of you, like my family, have maybe showed up at one of those beautiful state parks in Texas and had the gates closed or waited for 5 hours to get in. That happens because of a decision made about how much staffing the state parks get and how many resources they get. We know that way too many school teachers in Texas are paying for their own school supplies. That's happening because of decisions about how much funding public schools get.
Right.
Absolutely. All of these decisions that, literally affect our lives and how we go about our lives every day, and very importantly affect the future of our state and whether or not we're actually investing in increasing prosperity and innovation and a thriving Texas. All are affected by the state budget, and that's why we need all of you to get involved in it.
Exactly. Well, thank y'all so much for joining us today. Once again, I'm Gina Chavez. This is Ann Beeson of the Center for Public Policy Priorities, encouraging you to find out more about the Texas budget. You can come to our website at cppp.org. We're on Twitter. Obviously, you're on Facebook right now, but follow us on Twitter. Again, CPPP_TX. We're on Instagram as well, so please come find us and learn more about the Texas budget process, because it affects every Texan.